So did you know a couple of years back, Facebook, now Meta, wanted to hire a chief philosophical officer. All right. So Mark Zuckerberg actually was considering hiring a chief philosophical officer. What do you think about that? And do you think tech companies need a chief philosophical officer?
I don't know why he would need it, but I am not against the position of, if there is a chief philosopher officer, I would still apply for that role if it was open. It's just, I wonder what would entail of it. Because philosophy can be quite useful anywhere, since with your philosophy background, you're very good at organization, critical thinking, because you practice meta level thinking, and so that allows you to take a step back and have sort of, it's called the ivory tower in philosophy. So you have an ivory tower look, so you can be up there and also look down upon what's happening objectively. But then this is also criticized, because how true is that? Can you actually be objective? And is it always good to be up there in the ivory tower? Because people live normally. So how realistic is there to be up on the ivory tower and look down? So some people think you should be on the ground. And this is very metaphorical, but I hope you get the gist of what I'm trying to say.
No. Yeah, absolutely. Just
because
go for it.
In my head, I think the chief philosopher officer is up on the ivory tower because he's like the chief. But I mean, businesses work differently.
So everyone, welcome to the third episode of Steam Theater. We have a very special guest all the way from Netherlands, Venya Patel. We'll shortly introduce her. And for the new viewers who are joining in for the first time, this is a podcast where we talk about STEAM, which is science, technology, engineering, arts, and math. We get people from the industry on board to talk about how STEAM is used in day-to-day life. Right? So welcome. Hey, Venya, thanks for joining us.
Thanks. I'm glad to be here.
Yeah, and we'll have a couple of questions and some questions from our viewers, which we had put up before on our social media page. And also we had visited a few schools and many children had questions about career. So we're going to ask a couple of those questions also. So we're going to start off right away on the bat with asking you a brief intro about yourself. If you had to explain to children from 6th standard or 6th grade, of your background, what you do, and your master's in philosophy and undergraduate. So if you had to explain it to children, how are you going to introduce yourself?
Okay. I'd be like, hello, my name's Venya. I study philosophy, which is all about questioning the world. Any question that you bring up is valid. Well, most of the time. But it's learning about your identity, so who you are, why you are like this, or why others are like that, why is the world like this. So you look at those questions that you think are obvious to you, like answers that are obvious to you, and then you question that. So everything that you know, whatever you know, certain thing. Whatever you've been told growing up by society or your parents, philosophy comes in and then asks why or how, or questions it, and then thinks about whether that is, it could be thinking about whether that's good or bad, or it could be thinking about should it be like this or that, any types of questions.
How do you think we can make the educational content, since we were discussing making subjects or introducing new subjects, how do you think we can make educational content that is more diverse and inclusive?
I know this can be controversial. I mean, science likes to think that it's very objective and neutral to the world, and that because science is all about facts and studying, and you conduct studies and you sort of keep a distance. But in a way, science is all about being in the world. Like science is not separate from emotions, because if you want to study something, for example, if you want to evaluate something, why do you want to do that? Where does that intention comes from? It always comes from a desire or a feeling or something. If you conclude, if you make a hypothesis, why do you make that hypothesis? Because that hypothesis has to come from some sort of intention. Like my point is that it's not always black and white, and it's not always as distinct as it likes to be from emotions, because as humans, we are emotional creatures. It's hard to completely separate, have a distinction from, we're not completely distinct from emotions. So that comes in, I think, in everything that you do, no matter which profession you are. I mean, you can always try to minimize how emotions come into play. Like, I think the best way to go about education is through interdisciplinary means. What this means is you bring together ideas from different disciplines. So you have the science, biology, for example, and you have philosophy, and you have social sciences, etc. Because all these ideas, when you go to university, you see that they're interrelated. Scientists will be referencing philosophers. Philosophers will be referencing scientists. And people are doing this within the university, but they're not having discussions in person. Like, it's not a trend yet, but there's a lot of discussion about interdisciplinary methods, because it is through different disciplines that you will learn things about the same thing that you're trying to answer. So you get the answers, because it's always good to have many answers. Why should it always be one answer to one question that you're questioning? Like, it's not very realistic to think that this is the final answer to this question, because philosophy will question that fundamentality of it. Like, you can have facts which are proven, but those facts can also change through time. So science, I feel like, does not need to hold this superior position over anything. It's, of course, very respectable for what it does, but so are other disciplines, because they are also doing the same thing. I mean, of course, scientists can misunderstand other, for example, philosophers, just to use this as an example, and philosophers can also misunderstand scientists. And so in order to prevent that misunderstanding, they need to come together and have discussions. And in order to have discussions, first you need to come with an open attitude. If you come with this attitude of, I'm better than you, and I'm here to prove you wrong, you're not coming with an attitude to have a discussion, you're coming here to have an argument. Discussion is not the same as having an argument, to have a fight. I mean, because you can have arguments within a normal discussion if you're motivated more by answering the question that you have. So first you need to be, I feel like they need to be united by the purpose of what they're doing in order to have that discussion and be open-minded. If what someone is saying is wrong, you need to have reasons and explain not why they're wrong, but at least explain why you don't agree with them. Because who are you to say that you're completely wrong? Like, you can always, of course, express it, but it's always better to express your disagreements and then explain why you disagree with it. And then they will respond to that. And then you can have like a discussion, having back and forth. And even if nothing comes out of that discussion, you will come out with so much new knowledge, something, it might even change your perspective, change the approach that you're taking. So my doing philosophy is through interdisciplinary methods. So when I have a question or I'm writing about something, I'm not just going to study philosophers, because then it leaves you in a bubble. If you're in science and you only study what scientists have said, then it leaves you in a bubble of science. And the world does not work in bubbles. The world is huge. The world is interactive. It's always network. We're all interconnected. And so in order to even maybe broaden your thinking, your perspective, you need to go outside of what's more comfortable to you. If you're in science, go out, see what other disciplines are saying. Why are they saying that? you learn so much more from it, and then come back to your own discipline and then take an approach. But you can't do that unless, I mean, you can't do that if you think that you and your opinion and your background is better than the rest, because that's simply not true. Like science, first of all subjects came from philosophy, if you want to think about it historically. That's how you can write thesis. That's how you can write articles. You have to come up with something new. You cannot just repeat what other people have said. That's easy to do. And I feel like that's where university can be challenging, because in your thesis, if you have to write new research, how are you going to bring that? If you're only stuck in your own discipline, how are you going to get something new? Of course, there are new, new things that scientists find every day, but it's also very exciting to explore by combining your discipline with something else. Bring it together and see what comes out of it, you know? So that's what plays out in my everyday life as well.
Now, slowly moving to a slightly heavier question on your thoughts. So what are your thoughts on decolonizing education in India?
It always starts with awareness. Otherwise, what are you decolonizing? So once you start with that awareness that this perspective is from a colonial perspective, then maybe you thinking this on an individual level. So then the individual can go online and do research or talk about it with their friends, see what they think. So this is just very daily what could happen. But that's not decolonizing yet, because decolonizing is a very hard word. Like, it means complete removal of colonial influence. And that is a very hard thing to do. So there's a very famous paper called Decolonization is Not Just a Metaphor, or Is Not a Metaphor. And they take a very hard perspective that they're speaking more in the context of America. They're saying that if you want to so this is a country, let me just, speaking of that paper, they're talking about decolonizing America. And that means removing the foreign people who came to America, removal of them. So we cannot use decolonization in a very light way. So decolonizing Indian education, yeah, I feel like because it's so widespread and everyone has this sort of same education, it must come from change in government, how the education system works. Because if there's no change on a top level, it's very hard to see different subjects in your classroom. I mean, unless it's a private school or something, then there's more flexibility. But if it's a public school, there's not too much you can do. But what can be done apart from school is maybe much more, because school is one place of learning. But why not there be another place of learning? Maybe there can be an alternative school that someone can create, or again, speaking of after school tuition or workshop sort of thing, where students can go there and learn about why what they're learning is from a colonial background, or even teachers themselves, if they're in the classroom and they have to teach this particular book or historical perspective, then they themselves need to be aware and need to tell their students that this perspective is from a Western perspective, from a colonial perspective, and then from the indigenous or from the local perspective, this is what happened. So if you are taking like a case in history that occurred, you can tell a story through many different ways. And it's in the way that storytelling is done that decolonization can happen. So I've actually written a paper on this. It's not published yet, but it was all about using storytelling as a way of decolonizing classrooms.
Hmm.
So you can bring in different people within the classrooms. You can bring in people who have had different experiences to come in and tell their story, but not in a way that to judge them or critique them or anything, but they're here to share their perspective. And of course, if you're in that classroom, you should always be respectful of where they're coming from and be mindful and listen to their story. Because history is told through stories. It's always been told through stories. So if we're talking about decolonizing history, at least one way of doing it is through storytelling, bringing in old stories of how history was recorded. And maybe some will criticize, saying that it's not accurate because stories are not facts, which is true. But I feel like stories can bring in a lot more than just facts, because stories bring in that emotion, because through that feeling, you sort of get an idea what the experience of it was like back in history. Yeah, so there's a philosopher who says that the more perspectives we have, the more closer to objectivity we get. She's called Sandra Harding. She's like, I think, a feminist philosopher. And she writes this book about objectivity. So how can we be closer to objectivity? And one of her theory is about because if you have many different perspectives, you have a majority of you get a lot of different. For example, like if you're in a group of like 10 people and you get perspectives of 10 people, and you want to see what the the most objective thing is in that group, the more perspectives you have, the more closer towards objectivity you can get. So to give like a smaller example of it, so she means that plurality will bring us closer to objectivity. So the more different stories, the more different perspectives, even if they're clashing, it's okay. Because then it gives you a more realistic sense. I mean, what kind of reality do we live in that is always so linear? History is not linear. Experiences are not linear. We're living through multiplicities. We're different people living different lives. So the more differences that we have, the more plurality that we have, and the more understanding of these differences that we have, the more better understanding we can have of history. I wanted to bring in something about decolonizing the education, is also bring in perspectives from indigenous people who live in villages or in rural areas, what their stories are. You don't hear about that in your classrooms and history books, because the more you diversify what you know, in a sense, bring in more perspectives. For me, diversification means bring in different perspectives. So the more you bring in different perspectives, first of all, you give respect to the people who actually have lived through it and don't get representation, whilst also taking in what the majority of the a story is or the idea is. Bring it all together, and yeah, don't forget about them.
Anyway, we come to the last question. It's a general question I ask everyone, but the question I ask is usually, tell us your fondest memory from the world of science, is a question.
I think it's when last year I went to I attended this summer school on the post-human, and there we had one day of watching this documentary on the scientist called Lynn Margulis. And after watching that, on that day, I just became obsessed with her.
What?
Because oh yeah, she's a biologist who is a very as a character herself is very strong. She was the one who theorized symbiosis as a theory of evolution, like symbiosis. Yeah, as a theory of evolution. And so she is a Darwinist, but she's not a neo-Darwinist. She is a Darwinist, and she's not a neo-Darwinist. She studies bacteria, and I thought it was super cool, whatever she did, and because that has inspired me to do my PhD at some point. I'm gonna definitely base my research on her, and just the different facts I learned from her about how the mitochondria is a result of a symbiotic relation between two bacteria, billions of years ago, but how we have more bacterial cells than we have human cells in a way. Just she brought in a very different perspective from the perspective of bacteria, and that made me rethink what it means to be human. It made me rethink my own perspective of myself. And this is from a scientist. She's a biologist, but she's not this dry kind of biologist. She writes very accessibly, and in that documentary, you could see her act. I mean, she has already passed away, but you could see what kind of character she was. She had a very strong character, and whatever she did back then was against the norm. So she had to fight being a woman in science, first of all. She never got funding from the government. She only got funding from NASA. Because her theories were going against the mainstream or the theory, which was all about neo-Darwinism. So she had really had guts to do that. So seeing her personal sort of way of carrying herself, but also her professionalism and enthusiasm for science made me really inspired, not as a scientist, but as a philosopher. So this is one really good example of interdisciplinary learning, of how different disciplines can really, I don't know, change your perspective of life. I mean, you'd think that scientists would gain a different perspective from philosophy, but it can also happen the other way around.
Yeah.
So that's one of my favorite memories, I would say.
Oh, that's
Suddenly
lovely.
watching
That's why you're... Yeah, go ahead.
No, after watching that documentary, I had to watch it again. I think it's called Symbiotic Earth. Might be wrong.
We'll link it here in our YouTube description. So great, that was wonderful. Thank you so much for your inputs on all the questions, and it was very different, for us.
Yeah.
Tell. Yeah, tell.
No, I was just saying I blabbered a lot. I went round and round.
Well, I mean, that's what you're supposed to do, right? So